A young woman stood at the edge of the only home she had ever known and watched the door close against her. No tears, no begging, just the cold click of a latch and a deed to a worthless piece of land pressed into her hands like a sentence. A hill nobody wanted, a flock that would surely die, and a winter already breathing down out of the dark mountains. Down in the valley, they were laughing. They had placed their bets. They had shaken their heads. They had decided exactly how her story would end. She won't last. But up on that worthless hill, in the freezing wind, she knelt down in the frozen dirt and lifted a blade against the hard ground. She wasn't going to build a wall against the coming storm. She was going to do something no one had ever seen. And the whole valley was about to learn just how wrong they'd been. Her name was Marin Hale, and she had just turned 20 years old, and already cast out. She stood on the rise of that hill in the thin autumn light, and the wind came down off the high country and pressed against her like a hand. It was a dry wind, a scouring wind, the kind that carried no softness in it, no promise of gentle snow, only the warning of what was coming. Below her, in a crooked pen of lashed saplings, stood the only thing she had left in the world. 20 ewes, 2 rams, 22 soft, breathing creatures who had no idea their lives now rested entirely on the shoulders of a girl the whole valley had given up on. She looked at them for a long time, and then she looked at the hill to understand how she came to be standing there, alone, with a flock and a few silver coins and a piece of land no sensible person would take. You have to understand the house she came from. It was a good house, solid timber, a wide hearth, a barn her father had built with his own hands in the years when his hands were younger and his heart was still soft. Once, it had been a home filled with one kind of warmth, her mother's kind. But her mother had been gone a long while now, long enough that the corners of the house had begun to forget her, and a man does not stay alone forever in a country that hard. So her father had married again. He had brought a new woman into the house, a woman from a far-off city who arrived with fine boots and softer hands and a way of looking at the land as though it had personally offended her. And from the very first day, that woman did not like the girl. It was not hatred. Marin would never have called it that. It was something quieter, something colder. The new wife looked at Marin and saw all the things she herself could not do. The girl could read the sky. The girl could find water. The girl could set a broken fence and birth a lamb in the dark and know, just by the smell of the wind, when a storm was 3 days out. The girl belonged to the land in a way the new wife never would. And so every quiet competence of Marin's became a kind of accusation. Everything the girl did well was a mirror the woman did not want to look into. The house grew tense, then brittle, then sharp, and a house like that, it is only ever waiting for one small thing to break it open. The small thing, when it came, was almost laughable. It was a disagreement over how to cure a side of meat. That was all. The new wife had her way, learned from a city kitchen, and Marin had her mother's way, the old way, the way that had been handed down through patient hands across more years than anyone could count. Marin spoke up for it, gently. She did not raise her voice. She only said, "My mother did it like this. And in that house, in that brittle, breaking house, Those 4 words were enough. The new wife wept. The new wife said the girl had no respect. The new wife said she could not live under a roof where she was challenged in her own kitchen. And the father, oh, the father. He was a man worn down by loss, a man who had buried one wife and was terrified, in some deep place he would never admit to, of being left alone again. So he chose peace. He chose the easy quiet over the harder truth. He looked at his daughter, his clever, capable, motherless daughter, and he gave her a choice that was not a choice at all. Bend or leave. Maren did not bend. She had never learned how. And so, on a gray morning with the first hard frost still silver on the ground, her father walked her out to the edge of his land. He did not shout. He did not strike her. In his own mind, he was not even being cruel. In his own mind, he was teaching her a lesson. He handed her a folded paper, a deed to the hill, that worthless, sloping, rock-choked hill that no one in 3 counties would have paid $1 for. A south-facing tilt of ground strewn with granite and tangled sage, too steep for a proper house, too poor for a proper meadow. And he gave her the flock, the 22, because the new wife had no use for them. He thought she would fail. He was certain of it. He believed she would feel the cold bite of the world, lose everything, and come crawling back to his door before the snow grew deep, humbled and soft and ready, at last, to obey. He pointed the way off his land, and he turned and walked back to the house, and the woman waiting inside it. And he did not look back. She did not cry. That is the thing the valley would never have believed about her. She stood at the edge of the only home she had ever known, with a deed to a useless hill in one hand and a flock of frightened sheep at her back. And she did not cry. She simply turned and began to walk, and the sheep, because they trusted her, followed. Now, you might think a story like this is a story of cruelty. And in part, it is. But it is more than that. Because a person can be handed the worst thing in the world, the rejection, the cold shoulder, the closing door. And what happens next does not depend on the door. It depends on the person. And Maren Hale, walking up that hill in the failing light with everything she owned trailing behind her on 4 legs, was about to show a whole valley what she was made of. They just didn't know it yet. Neither, perhaps, did she. The hill, up close, was worse than it looked from below. The slope was steep enough that loose stones slid underfoot. The sage grew thick and gnarled, its roots woven into the earth like old rope. There was no flat place to build, no sheltered hollow, no spring she could see, though she could smell water somewhere beneath the ground. The wind here was constant. It came down from the northwest and bent the grass flat and never seemed to rest. Any ordinary person standing on that hill would have seen only the problem: a flock with no shelter, a winter coming fast, no timber, no money, no barn, no hands to help her raise one. A barn took lumber she could not buy and nails she could not afford, and the labor of men who would never come. She counted her coins that first night, there in the open with the sheep bedded close for warmth. A few silver dollars, enough for salt, enough for flour, not enough for milled planks and iron nails, not nearly, and the cold was already in the ground. She could feel it through the blanket, through her bones. The slow, patient cold of a country that did not forgive. Down in the valley, the verdict was already in. At the trading post where Verna Ashby's husband ran the counter, the men talked the way men talk about a thing they have already decided. They were not wicked men. You must understand that. They were tired, weathered, practical men who had each fought the land for everything they owned, and had each, somewhere along the way, lost something to it. To them, the girl on the hill was not a tragedy. She was a foregone conclusion. A flock with no shelter, they said. In this country, before the deep snow. They shook their heads. The girl will lose them all by Christmas. Then she'll go home, and she'll have learned her lesson. There was one man among them who said it louder than the rest. His name was Silas Crane. He was the most successful rancher in that part of the country, and he had earned every acre of it. A big man, broad through the shoulders, a face cured brown by 40 winters of doing things the proven way. Silas Crane believed in proven things. He believed in timber barns and iron nails and dry bedding and the wisdom passed down to him from men who had survived. And he held a deep, almost personal suspicion of anything new, anything clever, anything that had not already been tested by hardship and blood. So when he heard about the girl, about Marin Hale and her useless hill and her doomed little flock, he did something that, in a small and tight community, was almost a kind of violence. He made a wager. He leaned against the counter at the trading post, and he said it plain, so everyone could hear. He bet a good sum that the girl would not last to the deep of winter, that her flock would be dead or scattered by the worst of the cold, that she would crawl back to her father's door before the season turned. And the men, being men, took the bet. Some out of cruelty, most just out of the dull, dark comfort of agreeing with a powerful man. The wager spread through the valley like smoke. It became a thing people watched for, a piece of entertainment in a long, hard season. The girl on the hill, the fool with her sheep, the one who thought she could outsmart a winter that had killed stronger and wiser than her. Up on the hill, Marin did not know about the wager. Not yet. But she would. And when she did, something in her would harden into a fine, bright edge. Because there is a particular kind of strength that comes not from being loved, but from being underestimated. There is a fire that lights only when the whole world has already written you off. That fire was beginning to catch in her now. Quiet, banked low, but burning. That first night alone was the hardest. Not the work, not the cold, even the silence. She lay beneath her thin blanket with the sheep breathing soft around her and the great black sky wheeling overhead, and for the first time in her life, there was no roof above her and no door that was hers to close. And in that silence, the doubt came. It always does in the dark. What if they were right? What if the father and the wife and the men at the post and Silas Crane with his wager? What if all of them were simply right, and she was simply a foolish girl who had thrown her life away over the curing of a side of meat? The wind pressed against her. The cold reached up from the earth. And somewhere out in that dark, a thing she could not name was waiting. But then, in the deep of that long night, a memory came to her. And the memory was a voice. It was the voice of her grandfather, Her mother's father, a strange old man, long gone now, who had raised her more than half the time in those early years, when her mother was busy and the world was wide. He had been a trapper once, and before that, who knows? He was the kind of man who seemed to have lived 3 lives before anyone met him. But what made him strange, what made the other folks tilt their heads when he passed, was the way he saw the world. He did not look at the land the way other men did. He did not see it as a thing to be conquered, or fought, or beaten into giving up its riches. He looked at the land the way a man looks at an old friend whose every mood he has come to understand. He read it, the slant of the light, the lean of the grass, the way the smoke from a fire would rise on one day and lie low on another. And he taught the girl not what to do, but how to see. The memory that came to her, there in the cold and the dark, was a simple one. They had been out tracking, the 2 of them, in the lee of a high rock outcropping. She had been small. Her hand had been swallowed up in his, and he had stopped and gone very still, and he had pointed at a hole, a small dark opening tucked low against the base of the rock, half hidden in the shadow of the stone. A fox's den. She had not understood why it mattered. It was just a hole in the ground. But the old man had crouched down beside her, his knees cracking like old wood, and he had said something to her that she did not understand at the time, and would never, for the rest of her life, forget. He had said, "Look where she put her door, child." And the girl had looked, and she had seen that the opening of the den faced away from the wind, tucked into the sheltered side of the rock, angled so perfectly that the cruelest weather in the world could howl past and never reach inside. "The fox is no fool," the old man had said, his voice dry and soft as old leaves. "She does not build a wall against the winter. She does not fight a thing she cannot beat." He had patted the cold earth with one weathered hand. "She finds a place the winter cannot reach." And then he had said the thing that had lived, quiet and forgotten, in the bottom of the girl's heart for all the years between then and now. He had said, "Nature does not fight the winter, child. Nature outlasts it." Maren lay very still beneath her blanket. The wind pressed at her. The cold rose from the ground. And in the dark behind her eyes, she was no longer 20 years old, and cast out, and alone. She was small again, with her hand in her grandfather's hand, looking at a hole in the ground that had kept a small wild creature alive through 1,000 winters that would have killed a man. "The earth," he used to say, "the earth is a miser, child. It is greedy. It holds on to whatever it is given. The cool of the summer, the warmth of the autumn. It clutches it deep, and it lets it go slow." She had been too young then to understand, but she was not too young now. She opened her eyes. The sky was beginning to gray at the edge of the world. The first cold light of morning crept up over the far mountains, and it fell across the hill. The steep, useless, rock-choked hill that her father had given her as a punishment. And Maren Hale saw it, for the first time, with her grandfather's eyes. She did not see a barren slope. She did not see a problem. She saw a fox's den, waiting to be made. She sat up slowly. The realization was so simple and so total that it took her breath. She had been thinking about it all wrong. They all had. A barn was a wall against the winter, a fortress, a thing you built up out of timber and nails, standing proud and exposed against the sky, fighting the cold with every board. And the cold always won. In the end, the cold always found the cracks. It always stole the warmth through the walls and the roof and the seams. But what if you did not fight it? What if you did what the fox did? What if you did not build on the land, but built into it? A shelter dug down into the hill itself. A long, low burrow with the deep earth for its walls. The deep earth that held the autumn's warmth like a miser holds his gold. The deep earth that the killing wind could never reach. The hillside her father had called worthless was the only thing in this whole hard country that could save her. Not in spite of being a hill, because it was a hill. The very thing that made it useless for a house, the slope, the depth, the stone, made it perfect for the only kind of shelter she could afford to build. She did not need lumber she could not buy. She did not need the hands of men who would never come. She needed only the earth itself, and her own two hands, and the strange, patient wisdom of an old man who had known how to listen to the ground. She got to her feet. The sun was up now, full and cold and brilliant, throwing long blue shadows down the slope. She walked the hill slowly, the deed forgotten in her pocket, her eyes moving over the land in a way they never had before. She was not looking at it. She was reading it. She found the place midway up the slope, where the incline was steep, but the ground felt stable underfoot, where a slight natural dip in the hillside promised deeper, richer soil beneath the stone. She knelt down. She pressed her bare palm flat against the cold earth, and she felt it, faint, deep, almost a heartbeat. The land was not her enemy. The land had never been her enemy. It was the only friend she had left in the world, and it had been here, beneath her feet, all along, waiting. Down in the valley, they were laughing at her. She knew that now. She could feel it, the way you can feel a storm before it breaks. Somewhere, a powerful man had bet good money that she would crawl home broken. Somewhere, a father waited, certain, for the lesson to take. Somewhere, men shook their heads over a counter and called her a fool. Let them. Let them laugh. Let them watch. She rose to her feet, and she went to where her few poor tools were piled. Her grandfather's tools. A heavy-headed mattock, the wood worn smooth and dark by his hands and now by hers. A shovel, the blade thinned and shining from years of honest work. A single wheelbarrow with one squeaking wheel. It was not much. It was almost nothing. But it was enough. She wrapped her fingers around the handle of the mattock, her grandfather's mattock, and the cold of the morning was nothing against the warmth that had begun, very quietly, to rise inside her. She looked at the flock, 22 soft lives, waiting on her, trusting her. She looked at the hill, and then Murrin Hale, 20 years old and cast out and written off by every soul who knew her name, knelt down in the frozen dirt of a hill that nobody wanted, lifted the mattock high against the cold morning sky, and brought it down. The first blow bit into the earth with a sound like a struck bell. The valley did not hear it. The valley was busy laughing, but the hill heard it, and the hill, at last, began to open. She would dig for 3 weeks. She would bleed, and ache, and doubt, and dig. and before the worst winter that country had ever known came roaring down out of the north. She would carve out of a hill that everyone had called worthless, the one thing that no barn and no fortune and no proud man's wisdom could buy. A place the winter could not reach. But that is still to come. For now, there is only a girl and a hill and the first deep cut of a blade into frozen ground, and the slow, sure beginning of the answer to every soul who ever said she would not last. The first week, the hill fought her. It did not give up its ground easily. No hill ever does. The sod came first, that thick, tough carpet of buffalo grass and sage, its roots woven into a mat so dense it might have been a living thing in its own right. A thing that did not want to be parted from the earth that had grown it. A lesser worker would have hacked at it, torn it, ripped it loose in ragged, ruined clumps and thrown it aside as waste. Marin did not. She had been taught better than that. She worked with a strange, patient grace that did not match her age. She took the edge of her grandfather's shovel and she cut the sod in neat rectangles, 1 foot wide, 2 feet long, each one the same as the last, sliced clean and square, as careful as a woman cutting cloth for a dress she means to wear for years. Then she took the mattock, and she worked the blade beneath each rectangle, and she pried it loose, slow, gentle, peeling back the living skin of the earth in whole and unbroken pieces. And here is the thing the valley would never have understood. She did not throw the sod away. She laid each piece carefully aside, grass side up, in neat, patient stacks along the edge of her work, because that sod was not waste. That sod was treasure. That sod, though no one watching could have guessed it, was going to be her roof. The work was brutal. There is no softer word for it. She rose before the sun when the sky was still the deep blue-black of the dying night, and she worked until the light failed and her hands could no longer feel the handle of the shovel. She broke only to eat dried meat, a little flour cooked thin over a small fire, and to check on the flock. The first day left her with nothing but a raw brown rectangle of bare earth and a body that screamed. Her shoulders burned, her palms blistered, then bled, then blistered over the blood. Her back locked up at night so that she lay rigid beneath her blanket, staring at the stars, unable to turn over. But in the morning, she rose, and she dug again, and slowly, so slowly that from the valley it must have looked like nothing at all. The hill began to open, 1 foot deep, then 2. The bare rectangle became a shallow trench. The trench became a pit. The pit deepened until she had to climb down into it and toss the loose earth up over her shoulder, then up onto the squeaking wheelbarrow, then out again and again until the mound of excavated soil beside the hole grew into a small hill of its own. She was, quite literally, moving a piece of the world by hand, alone. And every spadeful of dirt she lifted was a single, silent word in the long answer she was writing to everyone who had said she could not. It was on the 3rd day of her digging that the shadow of a horse and rider fell across her work. She did not look up at once. She felt him there, the way you feel someone watching, and she kept the rhythm of her swing. Mattock down, break the earth, shovel the loose soil, lift, turn, toss, because she would not let him see her stop for him. Only when the silence had stretched long and heavy did she finally straighten and lean on the handle of her shovel, and wipe a line of sweat from her brow with the back of one bleeding forearm. And she looked up at Silas Crane. He sat astride his horse on the ridge above her, and he looked down at the hole in the ground and at the girl standing in the bottom of it, and a small, knowing smile played at the corner of his mouth. It was not a cruel smile. That was the worst part. It would have been easier if it had been cruel. It was a patient smile, the smile of a man who already knows how a thing is going to end and is only waiting, kindly, to be proven right. He clicked his tongue, and the horse picked its careful way down through the sage, and he came to the edge of her excavation, and he looked into it. The hole was nearly 4 feet deep by then. "That," he said at last, "is a powerful lot of digging for a root cellar." She said nothing. She only watched him. "What's your purpose here, girl?" he asked, and his voice was not unkind. That was the thing. His voice was almost gentle, heavy with the soft, suffocating weight of a man who is certain he is being patient with a child. So she told him, plainly, without flourish, the way her grandfather had taught her to speak of true things. "It's for the sheep, Mr. Crane," she said. "A winter shelter." And then she explained it. She told him how the earth, below a certain depth, held its temperature steady, summer and winter alike. She told him how the warmth of the flock's own bodies, trapped within the close earthen walls, would be enough to hold off the killing cold. She told him about the sod, the careful stacks of it, how it would become a living roof, a blanket of insulation grown right out of the ground. She spoke of the earth as a miser, a thing that holds what it has and lets it go slow. She spoke the way her grandfather had spoken, and Silas Crane listened, with his head cocked to one side, and that patient smile never once left his face. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he kicked a loose clod of dirt with the toe of his boot, and it tumbled down into her hole and broke apart against the bottom. "The earth holds damp, miss," he said, and his voice had changed now. There was something underneath the kindness, the cold certainty of a man stating a law of the world. Damp kills sheep, faster than cold ever will. They need air. They need dry bedding under their feet. A timber barn. He gestured back toward the valley, toward the proven world he had built for himself. A timber barn breathes. He looked down into the hole again. "This," he said softly. "This is a tomb." The word hung in the cold air between them. "A tomb. You'll bury them alive," he went on, and now he sounded almost sorrowful. "In the damp and the dark and their own filth. They'll start coughing by the new year, and they'll cough themselves to death before the snow's even gone." He was not trying to wound her. You have to understand that. In his own mind, Silas Crane was trying to save her. He was stating what he believed as surely as he believed the sun would rise. A law of animal husbandry written in 40 years of cold experience. He shook his head slowly. "Your father has a fine barn, miss," he said, and a bit of humility. "Would keep your flock a sight warmer than this hole in the ground ever will." He gathered his reins. He looked at her one last time, and there was pity in it now, plain and undisguised, and pity is a heavier thing to carry than scorn. Then he turned his horse and rode back up the ridge, and the leather of his saddle squeaked in the great cold silence, and he was gone. And Marin Hale stood alone in the bottom of her 4-foot hole, with the word tomb still ringing in her ears. Now, here is where a weaker spirit would have broken. Here is where the doubt, that cold, patient thing that had whispered to her in the dark of the first night, would have crept back in and curled around her heart and squeezed. What if he's right? He has 40 winters behind him. What do you have? A dead man's stories, and a hole in the ground. And for one long moment, standing there in the cold shadow of the man's certainty, she did feel it, the fear. But then, something else rose up to meet it, because Silas Crane, in his certainty, had made a mistake. He had told her she was wrong, and he had been so sure, so smug in his 40 proven winters, that he had not stopped to wonder whether she might be wrong about only part of it. Damp kills sheep. Yes, that much was true. He was not lying about that. But a true thing said by a proud man is still only half the story, because the fox in the den, the fox her grandfather had shown her, the fox did not die of damp. The fox had been doing this for 10,000 winters, and the fox was no fool, so Marin did not break. She got angry. And there is a particular kind of strength that anger gives a person when it is the right kind of anger, the cold, clear, focused kind, not the kind that makes you shout, the kind that makes you think. She climbed up out of her hole, and she looked at the sky going gray over the mountains, and she let Silas Crane's words turn over and over in her mind. Damp, stagnant air, coughing, dark. He had handed her, without ever meaning to, the exact list of every way her plan could fail, and a person who knows exactly how a thing can fail is a person who can build it, so it doesn't. That night, by the small light of a tallow lamp, she did not sleep. She thought. She thought about her grandfather and the things he had shown her over all those years, and the strange corners of the world he had carried in his head. And somewhere in those memories, she found it. A winter cabin, a trapper's place, high in the country, that the old man had taken her to once when she was small. A low, half-buried little thing, dug into a slope, and she remembered. She had asked him why there was a little chimney of stacked stones at the back of it, far from the hearth, and the old man had smiled, and he had said, "That one's not for the smoke, child. That one's so the cabin can breathe." She sat up, in the dark, in the cold, with the sheep breathing soft around her. The last piece of it fell into place. Silas Crane thought she would bury her flock in stagnant, killing air. He thought she had forgotten the one thing that would doom them. But she had not forgotten it. She had simply not gotten to it yet. And now, thanks to him, she knew exactly what she had to build. The next morning, she dug deeper and harder, and with a fire in her that had not been there before. The pit became a chamber. She did not stop at a simple hole. She had a shape in her mind now, clear and complete, and she dug toward it the way a sculptor cuts toward the figure he can already see inside the stone. Long, narrow, driven straight back into the body of the hill. 40 feet deep, 12 feet wide, 7 feet high. Just enough that she could stand upright at the center with her fingertips brushing the earth above her. The walls she cut perfectly vertical, smooth, true. She did not know it, but those straight walls would soon catch the eye of the only soul in that whole valley who would think to look at her work and see, not a fool's folly, but a craftsman's hand. That soul came riding up one gray afternoon, not on a fine horse, not with a wager in her pocket or pity on her face. She came quietly, a woman past the middle of her years, with a face weathered soft and kind, and a back kept straight by a lifetime of carrying her own loads. Her name was Verna Ashby, and she was a widow. Verna Ashby knew something about being written off. She had carved her own small place out of a poor piece of ground years back after her husband died and left her with nothing but a name and a debt, and a country that had no patience for a woman alone. The valley had counted her out too, once. They had been wrong about her. And maybe that was why, when she heard the men laughing at the trading post about the foolish girl digging her own grave up on the worthless hill, something in Verna Ashby's chest had gone tight and quiet and cold. So she had wrapped a loaf of bread in a clean cloth while it was still warm from the hearth. And she had ridden up the hill. She did not call out advice. She did not offer judgment. She did not tell the girl what a man with 40 winters thought about damp and dark and tombs. She simply rode up to the edge of the great cut in the hillside, and she looked. She looked at the neat stacks of sod, laid careful and grass side up. She looked at the small mountain of moved earth. She looked at the scavenged timber the girl had dragged, beam by beam, from some collapsed old shack miles away. And then she looked at the walls of the excavation, perfectly vertical, smooth, true. Verna Ashby was quiet for a long moment. Then she climbed down off her horse, and she held out the loaf of bread, still warm in its cloth. Marin took it, and for the first time in many days, her throat went tight, and her eyes stung, and she had to look away at the hill so the older woman would not see. Kindness, it turns out, is harder to bear than cruelty. Cruelty you can fight. Cruelty puts the fire in you. But kindness slips right past the wall you've built and finds the soft and frightened thing still hiding behind it. Verna Ashby did not say much. She looked one more time at the long, straight, true-cut wall of the excavation, and then she nodded. Once. "That's a straight cut," she said. That was all. 3 words. That's a straight cut. And you might think 3 words is a small thing, but you would be wrong. Because in a whole valley that saw a tomb, in a whole valley that saw a fool, in a whole valley that had already placed its bets and shaken its heads and decided how the story would end, one person had ridden up the hill and seen the truth, not the whole, the craft. Verna Ashby climbed back onto her horse. She did not promise to come again. She did not offer to help. She knew, the way one proud and self-made woman knows another, that the girl would not want it. Not yet. Not while she still had something to prove. She simply turned her horse and rode back down the hill and was gone. But she left behind 2 things: a loaf of warm bread and the first crack of light in the long, cold wall of the girl's loneliness. That bread fed her for 3 days, and the 3 words fed her far longer than that. Because in the hard weeks that followed, when the work ground her down to bone and blister, when the doubt came creeping back in the dark, when the wind howled and the cold deepened and her whole body begged her to stop, she would think of Verna Ashby looking at the wall and saying that's a straight cut, and she would lift the shovel again. The digging went on for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of rising before the sun and working until she could not see. 3 weeks of moving the earth a single spadeful at a time. Her hands grew hard as horn. Her body grew lean and strong and sure. The soft girl who had walked out of her father's house was being slowly carved away. And in her place, something tempered was emerging, something forged. But the hill was not done testing her, because a shelter needs more than walls and a roof. It needs water. And a flock sealed against a killing winter cannot be led out to a frozen creek every morning without bleeding away the very warmth she had broken her body to keep. Open that door each day into the teeth of the cold, and she might as well not have dug at all. She had known this from the very start. She had known it that first night in the open, when she lay on the bare ground and smelled it, faint and mineral and close. Water, somewhere beneath her, down in the dark where she could not see it. Her grandfather had taught her that too, how the earth keeps its water the same way it keeps its warmth, hidden, greedy, down below the line where the frost can reach. You do not go looking for it on the surface, he used to say. The surface is where the world keeps its lies. You go down for the truth. So one gray morning, midway through the long weeks of work, she stopped digging into the hill, and she began to dig down. She chose the lowest corner of the chamber, where the floor sloped just slightly, where the air felt heaviest and dampest against her cheek. And she sank a narrow pit, straight down, deeper than her own height. The work here was different, worse in its way. The deeper she went, the colder and heavier the soil became, and there was no room to swing the mattock, only to chip and scrape and haul the wet earth up in a bucket on a rope. For a long time, there was nothing, just cold mud and the burn in her shoulders and the small, mean voice in the back of her mind whispering that she had guessed wrong, that the smell had been nothing but the creek a quarter-mile off, that she had dug herself a useless pit at the bottom of a useless hole in a useless hill. And then, late in the afternoon, with the light failing and her arms shaking, the soil at the bottom of the pit went dark. Not muddy dark, wet dark. She knelt down in the cramped space and pressed her palm flat against it, the way she had pressed it against the hill that first morning. And it was cold, and it was damp, and as she watched, slow as the turning of a season, a small clear bead of water gathered in the print her hand had left, then another, then a thin, steady seep, welling up from somewhere deep beneath the killing winter, untouched by any frost the sky could send. She did not cheer. She did not weep. She simply knelt there in the dark, watching the water rise into the little hollow she had made, and she felt the old man so close beside her in that moment that she almost spoke his name aloud. You go down for the truth, child. She lined the little well with the flattest of her creek stones so the water would stay clean. And from that day on, no matter how the world above her froze and howled and died, there would be water in the hill, cold, clean, patient, held, like everything else, by the miser earth. And then, at last, the chamber was finished. A long, dark, narrow room driven deep into the body of the hill. But a room is not a shelter. A shelter needs a roof. And the roof was the hardest part of all. She used the timber she had hauled, old pine, a few sturdy posts. She sank 3 thick beams deep into the earthen floor down the center of the chamber, and she laid a heavy ridgepole across their tops, like the spine of some great buried creature. From the ridgepole, she ran rafters of smaller timber down to the edges, building the skeleton of the roof. Over the rafters, she laid a thick mat of densely woven brush, and over the brush, she stretched an old, heavy canvas tarp, which she waterproofed, inch by patient inch, with the very last of her tallow. This was the thing Silas Crane was certain she had forgotten: the moisture barrier, the seal against the wet that he had promised would rot her flock alive. She had not forgotten it. She had simply known that a thing built right takes time. Watching how a thing ends, she thought, as she worked the tallow into the canvas, is not the same as understanding how it works. It was something the old man used to say, in his own words. They saw a hole, she thought. They never saw the system. And then came the part that no one in the valley would have thought to build at all. The part that answered the deepest truth in everything Silas Crane had said. Because he had been right about one thing, truly right. Stagnant, damp, breathless air would kill a flock packed into a buried room. That much was no proud man's foolishness. That much was simple fact. So at the far deepest end of the chamber, she built the lungs. She carried flat stones up from the dry bed of the creek, one heavy load at a time, in the squeaking wheelbarrow, and she fitted them together, patient as a mason, sealing the gaps with a mortar of wet clay and grass. She built a narrow shaft of stone that rose up through the back of the hill and broke the surface a good 2 feet above the ground. A chimney, but not a chimney for smoke, a chimney for breath. She crowned it with a cap she shaped from a scrap of scavenged tin, angled just so that snow and rain would slide away from the opening, but the warm, used, moisture-heavy air rising up from the flock below could still escape. And as that warm air rose and slipped out through the top of the shaft, it would pull. It would draw fresh, cold, dry air down and in through the gap she had left, on purpose, around the heavy plank door at the front. A slow, constant, silent circulation. Air moving, always moving. Out the back, in the front, so that the breath of 22 animals could never go stale, so that the killing damp could never gather and settle and rot. The lungs of the hill, breathing. It was a simple thing. That was the beauty of it. There was nothing clever or proud about it at all. It was borrowed, every piece, from a fox's den and a trapper's cabin, and an old man who had known how to look at the world. It was the kind of cleverness no one teaches you, the kind you only learn from someone who loved you enough to make you watch. Silas Crane had stood at the edge of her hole and seen a tomb. He had been so sure, but a tomb does not breathe. And this was going to breathe. The last task was the roof of living sod. She had to haul each of those heavy squares she had cut weeks before up a makeshift ramp of packed earth and lay them, one by one, across the canvas-covered rafters. She started at the bottom and worked her way up, overlapping each piece over the one below it, the way you lay shingles, packing the seams between them with loose, dark soil, grass side up. Always grass side up. Because she knew something even then that the valley would have laughed at. She knew that come the spring rains, the roots of all that grass would wake and reach and grow down into one another, knitting the whole roof together into a single living thing, waterproof, windproof, and heavy beyond moving. A roof that was alive. A roof that would only grow stronger the longer the world tried to tear it down. When it was finished, she stood back in the last cold light of a dying afternoon, and the thing she had built had all but vanished. That was the strangest part. There was no proud structure standing against the sky, no timber walls, no fortress, nothing for the valley to point at and admire or fear. There was only the hillside, grass and stone and sage, just as it had always been. And if you looked closely, a heavy timber-framed doorway set low into the slope. And farther up, a small stone chimney, no taller than a fence post, poking out of the grass. That was all. It did not look like a building. It looked like a den, a place where some large, quiet, patient creature had chosen to wait out the winter, which, in a way, was exactly what it was. She finished her work as the first true cold came down out of the north. The nights now left the whole world rimed in silver. The hard frost sealed the ground. The wind carried a new and serious edge. She moved her few poor belongings into a small section at the front of the shelter, which she partitioned off for herself with a hanging blanket. The air inside was cool, and it smelled richly of damp earth and cut timber. But it was a still cold, a quiet cold, utterly different from the biting, wind-driven thing that prowled outside. And then, at last, she brought in the flock. They were hesitant at first. They sniffed at the dark opening and balked and would not go. They were creatures of the open sky, and a hole in a hill is a frightening thing to a sheep. But she coaxed them, gently, with a little grain in her cupped hand, and her low and steady voice, and the patience she had learned from an old man a long time ago. And one by one, they went in. They filled the long, dark room. 22 soft bodies, pressed warm against one another in the deep earth, and almost at once, she felt it. The air began to change. The warmth of their bodies rose up off them in a soft animal heat, and it gathered, and it held, the way her grandfather had promised that it would. The earthen walls did not steal it away the way timber walls would have. The earth was a miser. The earth held on. She stood among them in the dark, with the smell of lanolin and clean hay and warm wool all around her, and she listened. She listened to the slow, soft sound of the flock, and beneath it, faint and constant, the breath of the hill itself, the cold, dry air slipping in around the door, the warm, used air rising and escaping out the back, in and out, in and out. She went to the deep end of the chamber, and she held up her hand near the foot of the stone shaft, and she felt it. A faint, steady draft, cool air being drawn in from the front, all the way down the length of the room, and up and out through the lungs she had built of creek stone and clay. It was working. The system was working. Exactly as she had known, in her bones, that it would. She barred the heavy plank door from the inside, and she sat down in the warm dark with her flock all around her, and for the first time in many long weeks, she let herself rest. She had done it. She had taken a useless hill and a few bleeding weeks, and a dead man's wisdom, and the cold fuel of every soul who had written her off, and she had built a thing that no money could buy, and no proud man would ever think to build. A place the winter could not reach. Down in the valley, they were still laughing. The wager still stood. The men still shook their heads. Silas Crane still rode past now and again, glancing up at the silent hillside with a small, certain, pitying smile, waiting for the coughing to start, waiting for the girl to break. And once, she would learn of this later. He had even ridden among his neighbors and told them, plainly, not to waste their charity on her. "Don't go carrying bread up that hill," he had said. "You'll only be prolonging the lesson. The kinder thing is to let her fail quick and come home." He thought he was being wise. He thought he was being kind. He did not know that one woman had already carried the bread. He did not know that the lesson he was waiting to teach was about to be taught to him. For high on that silent hill, beneath a roof of living grass, a girl and her flock were warm. The cold could howl. The frost could harden. The whole valley could laugh until it lost its breath. It would not reach her. It would not reach a single one of them. She had seen to that. But the winter that was coming, the winter that was gathering, even now, in the gray distance beyond the northern mountains, was not going to be an ordinary winter. It was going to be the kind of winter that comes only once in the long memory of a place. The kind of winter that does not test a person, but unmakes them. And when it came down out of the dark at last, with a fury that would freeze the marrow in a strong man's bones and bury whole flocks where they stood, it would find that nearly everyone in that valley had built their shelter the proven way, the way Silas Crane had taught them, walls against the storm, and it would find one girl up on a worthless hill who had not built a wall at all, who had done the strange thing, the mocked thing, the foolish thing, who had not fought the winter, but had found the one place it could not reach. And that is where the story truly turns. The trouble came in the night. It always does. The thing you fear in daylight is only a thought. But in the dark, in the deep, cold, silent dark, a thought becomes a hand around your throat. It was the worst hour of the night when she heard it. A low groan, then a soft, heavy sound, like the world settling its weight, and then a slow trickle of loose, cold soil, falling. Somewhere in the dark above her head, she was on her feet before she was fully awake. The tallow lamp flared in her shaking hand. The flock stirred and pressed and bleated low, restless, frightened by the sound they could not name. She lifted the light high, and she saw it. At the far end of the chamber, near the back, a section of the roof had begun to sag. The canvas had pulled loose at one seam. A rafter had shifted, and through the gap, a slow, steady fall of dark earth was sifting down into the shelter, onto the bedding, onto the backs of the sheep huddled beneath it. A piece of her roof, failing, for one long, terrible moment. She could not move. She just stood there in the cold and the flickering light, staring up at the wound in the thing she had bled 3 weeks to build. And every word Silas Crane had ever said to her came flooding back, all at once, in his calm and certain voice. "This is a tomb. You'll bury them alive. A bit of humility would keep your flock warmer than this hole in the ground." She had been so sure, so proud in her quiet way, so certain that the dead man's wisdom in her head was worth more than 40 winters of a living man's experience. And now the roof was coming down. In the dark, with the deep winter only days away. She worked through the rest of that night. She did not let herself feel. There was no time to feel. She climbed up to the failing seam, and she braced the shifted rafter with a length of spare timber, and she packed the gap with fresh wet clay and loose soil, and she pressed the canvas back into place with her bare and freezing hands until her fingers had no feeling left in them at all. By the time the gray light crept under the door, the roof was holding again. But the damage to her was not in the roof. The damage was in the small, cold seed of doubt that had cracked open in her chest and begun, at last, to grow. And then, in the gray of that exhausted morning, came the second blow. She found one of the ewes lying still in the bedding. It was one of the older ones, one of the weaker ones, a small, gentle creature that had always come to her hand first, that had always pressed its soft head against her palm in the dark. It was not moving. She knelt beside it. She put her hand against its side. Nothing. In the night, while she had been fighting the roof, it had simply slipped away, whether from the cold, or from age, or from some sickness she had not seen. She would never know, but she knew what it would look like, to the valley, to her father, to Silas Crane. It would look like the beginning of exactly what they had all promised, the first of the dead. She carried the small body out into the brutal morning cold, and she laid it in the frozen sage, and she stood over it for a long time with the wind tearing at her. And there, at last, after 3 weeks of digging and aching and proving and holding, after a whole life of not bending and not breaking and not crying, Maren Hale broke. She did not weep loudly. That was not her way. She simply stood in the killing wind with a dead ewe at her feet and a wounded roof at her back, and she felt the whole cold weight of it come down on her at once. What if they were right? What if the old man's strange wisdom was just that, an old man's stories? And she had built a beautiful, clever grave for the only living things in the world that still trusted her. What if she had cut herself off from her father's warm house and his fine timber barn, out of pride, out of stubbornness, and these gentle creatures were going to pay for it, one cold body at a time, all winter long? The doubt had her now, both hands, and it squeezed. It was into that broken morning that Verna Ashby came riding up the hill. She did not come with bread this time. She came with something far heavier. She rode slow, and she did not meet the girl's eyes at first. And when she finally climbed down off her horse, she stood for a moment looking at the small, dead ewe lying in the frost, and the older woman's face went very tired, because Verna Ashby had come to deliver a message she did not want to carry. "Your father sent word," she said quietly. Maren went very still. "He's heard you're still up here. He's heard." The widow glanced again at the dead ewe and could not finish that part. "He sent word, child. Through the post. He said to tell you." She paused, and the wind blew, and the whole world seemed to hold its breath. "He said to tell you, come home, come home." 2 words. After everything, after the ultimatum and the closed door and the deed to the worthless hill, after being cast out like a thing of no value, to fail and to learn and to crawl back humbled. 2 words. Come home. And here is the cruelest thing of all, the thing that makes this the lowest point in the whole long story. She wanted to. God help her in that broken morning with a dead ewe at her feet and a cracked roof at her back and the deep winter bearing down. She wanted nothing in the world so much as to walk down off that hill and through her father's door into the warmth of a house that was not hers anymore. To be a daughter again, not a fool on a hill. To let someone else carry the weight for one single night. To be warm. And she stood there, swaying on her feet, with the easy way out held open in front of her like a hand, and the hardest decision of her young life waiting to be made. Verna Ashby watched her. The older woman did not push. She did not pull. She did not tell the girl what to do. She only said, very softly, "It's your choice, child." It always was. Nobody can make it for you. Not him. Not me. Not the whole Laughing Valley down below. And then she said one more thing, quiet, almost to herself. But I'll tell you what I see. I see a roof that held. I see 21 sheep still breathing in there, warm as toast, on the coldest morning this country's had all year. She looked at the small dead ewe. You didn't lose her to your hill, child. You lost her to her years. That one was old when she came up here. She climbed back onto her horse. "A house can keep you warm," she said, "but it can't make you who you are. Only the hard things do that." And she rode away. Marin stood alone for a long, long time. The wind tore at her. The cold reached into her. The two words hung in the air. Come home, come home, come home. And the dead ewe lay still in the frost, and the easy way out stayed open and waited. And then, slowly, she turned. She looked at the low timber doorway set into the hill. She thought of the 21 warm bodies behind it, the ones still breathing, the ones still trusting her. She thought of the old man's hand around her small hand, a lifetime ago, pointing at a fox's den. Nature does not fight the winter, child. Nature outlasts it. And something in her straightened. She did not go home. She turned her back on the easy warmth and the open hand and the two soft words. And she picked up her tools. She climbed back up onto her wounded roof in the killing cold, and she did not just patch the failing seam this time. She rebuilt it, stronger than before. She drove new braces. She doubled the rafters. She packed the sod down hard and tight, and she sealed every gap until not a single grain of soil could fall. She made it whole. She made it better. Because that is what the hard things do to a person when they do not break them. They make them better. That was 3 days before the sky changed. She saw it coming. Of course she did. The old man had not only taught her how to build, he had taught her how to see. And in the slow gray turning of those 3 days, she read the signs he had marked into her, one by one, like a language only she could speak. First, the cold went still. For weeks, the wind had never rested. But now, all at once, it died. The air grew heavy and silent and waiting. Then the smoke from her small cook fire would not rise. She lit it one morning and watched the smoke crawl low along the ground, refusing to climb, pressing itself flat against the frozen earth as though it, too, were afraid of the sky. Then the birds went quiet. All of them. At once, the whole world held its breath. And last, the strangest sign of all. A pale yellow light came creeping along the edge of the horizon, low and cold and sickly. A color the sky should never be. She had seen these signs once before, as a child, standing beside her grandfather, who had gone very still, and looked at that same yellow light, and said one word, "Blizzard." But not a blizzard like any other. She knew that too. She could feel it in the heaviness of the air, in the depth of the stillness, in the sickly color of that light. This was not a winter storm. This was the kind of thing that comes down out of the dark only once in the long memory of a place. The kind of thing the old ones tell stories about for the rest of their lives. This was the winter that unmakes, and it was coming for everyone. She did not panic. There was no time for fear now, and fear, anyway, had never saved a single living thing. She moved. She gathered the last of her firewood. She filled every container she owned with water from the creek that was already growing skins of ice along its edges. She checked the roof one final time, and the breathing shaft, and the gaps around the door. And then she brought the flock close and counted them. 21 now. And she shut them into the deep, warm dark of the hill. And she barred the heavy plank door from the inside, sealing herself and her flock and her whole fragile world into the body of the earth, against the thing that was coming. The first flakes came small and dry. They whispered against the wooden door. A soft, dry hiss, like sand. Within an hour, the whisper had become a roar. The wind rose and rose and rose past anything she had ever heard, until it was a single, endless, shrieking howl that seemed to want to tear the very world up by its roots and fling it into the dark. Out there, beyond her door, the temperature fell and fell and fell past the point where falling has a meaning anymore, to a cold so deep and so absolute that the very air itself seemed to crack. A cold that drove the snow sideways, packing it into drifts as hard as stone, sealing the world shut. Out there, it was a death sentence for anything that breathed, for anything caught in the open. There was no hope at all. And even for those who had built the proven way, the strong way, the way of timber walls raised proud against the sky, it was a desperate, losing war. Somewhere down in the valley, in his fine, sturdy barn, Silas Crane was fighting that war, fighting to keep his stock from piling into the corners and smothering, fighting the wind that clawed in through every seam and crack of his proven timber walls, fighting the snow that drifted in ghostly white piles inside the very structure he had built to keep it out. He had built a wall against the storm, and the storm was coming through the wall. But inside the hill, it was another world entirely. Maren sat in the warm dark, and she listened, and what she heard was not the shriek of the wind. What she heard was almost nothing at all. The great mass of earth and living sod above her swallowed the storm whole. It took that endless, world-ending howl and softened it, and muffled it, and pressed it down into a distant, dreaming murmur. Far off. Abstract, a rumor of fury that could not reach her. The shelter was dark, lit only by the small, steady flame of the tallow lamp, and the first thing she felt, the deepest thing, was not cold. It was stillness, a profound, holy, sheltering stillness. The air was cool, yes, but it was a living cool, a stable, breathing cool, not the invasive, killing thing that raged outside her door. The warmth of 21 bodies filled the long, dark room and held there, gathered by the patient miser Earth. Steam rose softly from the sheep's nostrils in the lamplight. The smell was lanolin and clean hay and damp earth and warm wool. And beneath it all, faint and constant, was the sound she had built into the very bones of the place, the slow breath of the hill, cold dry air slipping in around the door, warm used air rising and escaping out the stone shaft at the back, in and out, in and out. The lungs of the hill breathing steady, while the world outside screamed itself to death. She moved among her flock in the dark. She ran her hands along their warm backs. She spoke to them low, the way the old man had taught her, and they were calm beneath her touch, placid, chewing their cud in the dark, untroubled, as though the apocalypse outside their door were nothing more than a far-off rain. They did not know how close death was. They only knew that she had built them a place, and that they were warm, and that she was with them. And that was enough, for 3 days and 3 nights. The storm raged, and for 3 days and 3 nights. She tended her flock and slept and woke, and rationed the water and the fodder, and listened to the muffled, distant voice of the dying world. The first night was the loudest. The wind came against the hill like a living thing, like a great beast throwing its whole weight against the door, again and again, hunting for a way in. And the flock felt it. They pressed together in the dark, restless and frightened, their soft voices rising in a thin, anxious chorus that filled the long chamber. So she went among them. She moved slowly down the length of the room with the small lamp held low, touching each one as she passed, speaking to them the way the old man had once spoken to her in the dark when she was small and the night was wide. Easy now, easy. There was one young ewe, a skittish thing, that would not settle. It trembled against her legs and would not stop its crying. So she sat down on the dry bedding, right there in the middle of the flock, and she gathered the frightened creature against her chest, and she held it. She held it the way she had once wanted, on a cold gray morning at the edge of her father's land, to be held. And slowly, the trembling eased, and the crying stopped. And one by one, all down the dark, warm length of the hill, the flock grew quiet, until there was nothing left but the deep, slow sound of their breathing, and beneath it, fainter still, the steady breath of the hill itself. The second night, the fear came for her. Not the flock's fear, her own. The fodder was going faster than she had planned. The lamp oil was low. And the storm, which by every reckoning should have spent itself by now, only seemed to deepen, to settle in, to howl with the patience of a thing that meant to stay forever. And in the small hours, with the lamp guttering and the cold pressing close, the old whispers came creeping back. What if it never ends? What if you outlast the storm, only to starve in the dark you built for yourself? She sat very still and let the fear move through her, the way you let a hard wind move through bare branches, knowing the branches will still be standing when it passes. And then she thought of the water, the cold, clean water welling up patient in its little stone well, untouched by all the fury above. The truth she had gone down into the dark to find. You go down for the truth, child. And she understood, somewhere in that long second night, that she had already done the hardest part. She had already gone down into the dark. She was sitting in it now, and it was warm, and it was holding. There was nothing left to do but trust the thing she had built. So she trimmed the lamp low to save the oil, and she lay down among the warm, breathing bodies of her flock, and she slept. The third night was the strangest of all, because by the third night, the fear was simply gone. A kind of deep, still peace had settled over the hill, over the flock, over the girl. She no longer flinched at the muffled howling far above. She no longer counted the hours, or the fodder, or the drops of oil. She had stopped fighting the storm entirely, had stopped even, waiting for it to end. She had become, at last, like the fox in the den. She was not enduring the winter. She was simply outlasting it, breathing slow in the warm dark while the world screamed itself hoarse against a door it could not open. And lying there in the deep earth, with her whole living world breathing soft around her, she felt something she had not felt since long before her father pointed the way off his land. She felt safe, and her faith in the earth never once wavered. This was the test. The thing she had been built for exactly this. Every spadeful of moved earth, every careful square of sod, every stone of the breathing shaft, all of it had been for this single, howling, impossible test. And it was holding. Her hill was holding. On the morning of the fourth day, she woke to silence. The wind had died, and the silence it left behind was as vast and as total as the fury had been. A deep, white, ringing silence. The silence of a world made over in the night. She lay still for a moment, listening to it. Then she rose. She went to the heavy plank door. She lifted the bar, and she pushed. The door did not move. She pushed harder. Nothing. She set her shoulder against it and drove with all the lean, hard strength 3 weeks of digging had built into her body, and the door did not give a single inch. A wall of snow, packed by that endless wind into something nearly as hard as ice, had sealed the entrance completely, shut, from the outside, and for one moment, one cold, terrible, heart-stopping moment, the old fear rose up and seized her by the throat. Buried, sealed in, entombed. Every word Silas Crane had ever spoken rang out in the dark all at once. This is a tomb. You'll bury them alive. And here she was, in the dark, in the earth, behind a door that would not open, with the snow packed so hard and so deep that she could not tell if it was 1 foot thick or 20. A grave. He had said it would be a grave. And the panic clawed up her spine and into her chest and almost took her. But it passed, because she was not the soft girl who had walked out of her father's house. Not anymore. The hard things had made her into something else. And as the panic crested and broke, a single clear thought rose up beneath it, cold and bright and steady as a star. If the door is sealed shut from the outside, then the cold cannot get in. If she is buried, then so is the warmth. Held, trapped, kept. The very thing that should have terrified her was the proof that her hill had done exactly what she built it to do. The snow had not entombed them. The snow had tucked them in. She had her shovel, and she began to dig her way out. The snow was dense and heavy and packed hard as stone. It fought her the way the hill itself had fought her in the beginning. She carved a narrow tunnel up and out on a slant, working by feel and by the small light of the lamp. And the deeper she dug, the more she understood just how completely the storm had buried them. 3 feet. 5. More. It took her over an hour of hard, methodical work. And at last, near 10 feet up through the drift, her shovel broke through into open air. A shaft of light fell down through the hole. Pure, white, blinding. She widened the opening with her hands, and she pulled herself up through it, up and out of the body of the hill, up into a world she did not recognize. And she stood, and she looked. The world had been remade. There was no sagebrush, no creek, no fence, no trail, no sign that anything human had ever lived in this place. There was only a vast, silent, blinding sea of white, sculpted by the wind into long frozen waves, rolling away to the foot of mountains that stood stark and white and merciless against a sky of hard, perfect, cloudless blue. The sun blazed down, brilliant and without warmth. The air was so cold it stung her lungs and brought sharp tears to her eyes. She stood alone in all that white, a single small figure, breathing hard in an immense and frozen wilderness that had killed everything it touched. And then, slowly, she turned, and she looked back at the hole she had just climbed out of, and she saw it, rising up from the dark mouth of the tunnel she had dug, and from the small stone shaft poking up out of the snow farther up the slope, soft, steady, unmistakable steam. 2 faint plumes of warm vapor drifting up into the frozen, killing air. The breath of the hill, the visible, undeniable proof that down beneath all that white death, something was still warm. Something was still alive. She stood in the snow, and she stared at that rising steam. And the thing that washed over her was not pride. It was not triumph. It was something quieter and deeper and far more whole. It was the feeling of a person who had been told by everyone she had ever known that she was a fool, and who had been handed the worst the world could give, and who had not bent, and had not broken, and had not crawled home, and who now stood alive in a world full of death, with every reason to know that she had been right. She had listened to the earth, and the earth had kept her. She thought of an old man's voice, dry as autumn leaves. Find the place the winter cannot reach. And a slow, quiet smile touched her cold and chapped lips. She had found it. She had built it with her own 2 hands, out of a hill that nobody wanted. And now, while the proven world lay buried and broken all around her, her flock was breathing soft and warm in the dark beneath her feet. Every single one that the winter had not already taken by its years. Alive, down in the valley, though she could not see it yet. The cost of that long white silence was only beginning to be counted. And before many more days had passed, a small party of grim men would come struggling up that hillside through the drifts, expecting to dig a girl and her foolish flock out of a frozen grave. They would come as men come to confirm a death. And what they would find, standing in the snow, would change the way that whole valley understood the world. But that is the last turn of the story. For now, there is only a girl, standing alive in a world of white, watching the warm breath of her hill rise up into the cold blue sky, and knowing at last, all the way down to her bones, that she had not built a tomb. She had built a place where life could wait out the dark, and walk back into the light. The valley woke slowly, the way a body wakes from a long and terrible fever. For days after the wind died, nothing moved out there in all that white. The world had been buried, and the people who had lived in it, the ones who were left, crept out from their houses and their barns into a landscape they no longer recognized, and they began, with cold and shaking hands, to count what the long white silence had taken from them. It had taken a great deal. Whole flocks were simply gone. Cattle that had stood out in the open had become shapes beneath the drifts. Barns had buckled. Fences had vanished. The proven way, the strong way, the way of timber walls raised proud against the storm, had been tested by something larger than any wisdom the valley owned. And the proven way had not been enough. The cold had found every crack. It had come in through every seam. It had crept under every well-built door and stolen the warmth from every well-built room. And where it had passed, it had left only stillness behind. The people who survived did not feel like victors. They felt like the small, spared remnant of something that had nearly swallowed them all. And among them, his face gray, his hands raw, his proud shoulders bent, was Silas Crane. He had fought the storm with everything he had. He had a sturdy barn. He had 2 strong hired men. He had 40 winters of hard-won knowing and the respect of every soul in the valley, and the deep, unshakable certainty that he understood how the world worked. And he had lost nearly half his flock. Half. Frozen in the corners where they had piled against the cold. Smothered beneath the drifts that the wind had driven straight through his proven timber walls. He had built his wall against the storm, and he had stood inside it and watched the storm come through, and there had been nothing, nothing at all, that his 40 winters could do to stop it. It was 3 days after the silence, when the drifts had settled enough to walk on, that someone at the trading post said the thing aloud. The thing they had all been not saying. The girl on the hill. Nobody had seen smoke. Nobody had seen movement. Nobody had heard a single sound from that worthless slope since before the storm came down. And the men looked at one another over the cold counter, and they knew what that silence meant. It meant a tomb. Just as Silas Crane had promised all those weeks ago. So they gathered a party, a small grim party of men. They strapped on snowshoes, and they took shovels, and they set out across the frozen sea toward the hill, not as rescuers, but as a burial party. They were going to dig out a girl and her foolish flock, and they were going to carry what was left of her down the hill, and they were going to send word to a father who had only ever wanted to teach his daughter a lesson, that the lesson had cost him everything. And at the head of that grim party walked Silas Crane. He had insisted on it, whatever it was that drove him, guilt or grief, or the cold, hard weight of his own certainty. He would not let another man lead the way to the place where his promise had come true. They struggled up the slope through the drifts, and the closer they came, the quieter they grew, because something was wrong. Something was wrong with the picture in front of them. Something that did not fit the story they had carried up the hill in their hearts. There, on the white slope where the shelter had been, the snow had been cleared in a wide, deliberate patch, by hand, and the men slowed, and the men stopped, and the men stood in the snow, and they stared at a thing none of them could make their minds believe. There, in a makeshift pen scraped out of the snow, standing in the brilliant cold sun, were the sheep. Alive. Every one that the winter had not already taken by its years. Standing, breathing, healthy and placid and unbothered, their thick wool coats steaming faintly in the frozen air, chewing their cud as though nothing at all had happened, as though the end of the world had simply passed them by, and moving among them, calm, lean, her face chapped red by the cold, but her eyes clear and steady, was the girl, Marin Hale, alive. The men could not speak. It was so far outside everything they had believed, so completely against the story the whole valley had told itself for weeks, that for a long moment it seemed unreal, a trick of the snow and the blinding light, a thing the cold had put into their tired eyes. But it was real. She was real. The sheep were real. And it was Silas Crane who finally moved. He came forward slowly through the snow, one heavy step at a time. His face, that brown, weathered, certain face, had gone slack and pale with a thing that was not quite fear, and not quite grief, and not quite wonder, but held some terrible portion of all three. He looked at the living, breathing sheep. He looked at the simple, snow-covered mound of the hill, with its small stone chimney poking up through the drift, and the faint, steady wisp of warm vapor rising from it into the cold. He looked at the girl he had wagered against, the girl he had called a fool, the girl he had told the whole valley not to feed. And his voice, when it came, was rough and broken and barely above a whisper. "All of them?" he asked. Marin met his eyes. She did not gloat. There was nothing in her face of the triumph he might have deserved to see. She only looked at him, steady and quiet, the way her grandfather had once looked at the whole wide world. "Not one lost to the cold, Mr. Crane," she said. A pause. "We were quite comfortable." He shook his head slowly. He looked around himself. At the devastation the long white silence had carved into the valley below. At the buried barns and the vanished fences and the frozen shapes that had once been a thriving country. And then back at her small, impossible island of life. "May I?" His voice failed him. He tried again. "May I look inside?" She studied him for a moment, and then she simply nodded and stepped aside. Silas Crane ducked his head and went down through the low timber doorway into the dark. The other men followed, one by one. And what met them, the moment they passed through that door, was a thing none of them would ever forget for the rest of their days. Warmth. Not the roaring warmth of a fire. Something stranger, something deeper. A steady, living, sheltering warmth that rose up out of the very earth and wrapped around them after the killing cold outside, so sudden and so total that one of the men let out a sound that was almost a sob. The floor was dry beneath their boots, dry and covered with clean bedding. The air. And this was the thing that broke Silas Crane. The air was fresh, cool and clean and moving. The breath of the cold, dry world slipping in around the door, drawn down the length of the room, rising warm and used out the stone shaft at the back. He had stood at the edge of her hole all those weeks ago and promised her stagnant, killing air. And the air in here was sweeter than the air in his own fine barn. He reached out one bare, weathered hand and he pressed it flat against the packed earth of the wall. It was cool, but it was not frozen. The miser earth, holding its warmth, letting it go slow, just as a strange old man had said it would, once to a small girl, a lifetime ago. He looked up at the timber and the living sod above his head. He looked down the long, dark, breathing room to the small stone shaft at the far end. He looked, and slowly, behind that weathered face, something turned, because he was not a stupid man. He had never been a stupid man. That was the whole tragedy of him. He had only been a certain one. And now, standing in the warm dark beneath a hill he had called a tomb, Silas Crane stopped seeing the hole, and he started seeing the system. He understood the door and the gaps she had left in it on purpose. He understood the shaft and how it pulled. He understood the sod and the canvas and the moisture barrier he had sworn she'd forgotten. He understood that this girl he had pitied and dismissed and wagered against, had looked at the exact same winter he had looked at, with all his 40 years of knowing, and she had understood it better than he ever had. She had not fought it. She had outlasted it. He came back out of the doorway slowly, blinking in the blinding sun, and he stood in front of Marin Hale. And for a long moment, the most respected man in the valley could not find a single word to say to the girl he had spent a winter mocking. Then he reached up, and he took off his hat. It is a small thing, perhaps, to take off a hat, but you would have to have known Silas Crane to understand what it cost him, to have known the pride in him, the certainty, the 40 winners of being right, to understand that this man had never, in all his life, stood bareheaded before another soul and admitted that he had been wrong about the very thing he had built his whole life upon. He held the hat against his chest, and he said it, quiet, plain, carrying clear in the great white silence. I was wrong, miss. A breath. I spoke from ignorance, the kind of ignorance that's so sure of itself, it stops asking questions. He looked back at the dark doorway, at the warm breath rising from the hill. I've been building barns the same way for 40 years, and I never once, not once, thought to ask the ground what it knew. He shook his head slowly. This, he said, this is the smartest piece of building these eyes have ever seen. It was not a grudging thing. It was a complete and total surrender. The unconditional laying down of everything he had been certain of, at the feet of a truth he could no longer deny. And here is where the story could have ended. Here is where, in a harder tale, the girl would have had her moment, her cold, sweet revenge. She could have looked at the broken, bareheaded man who had wagered on her ruin, and she could have reminded him of every word. Tomb, he had called it. A bit of humility would keep your flock warmer. She could have stood there, in the ruins of his certainty, and she could have made him taste every single one of those words. And no one would have blamed her. No one in that whole spared and shivering valley would have said she did not have the right. But Marin Hale did not do that. She looked at the man standing bareheaded in the snow, a man who had lost half of everything he owned, a man whose whole world had just been turned upside down in the space of a single morning. And what she felt was not triumph. It was something she had not expected at all. It was something close to pity. The same pity, she realized, that he had once felt for her. Only hers had no scorn folded inside it. "You weren't wrong about the damp, Mr. Crane," she said quietly. He looked up at her, startled. "Stagnant air would have killed them. You were right about that. You were right about more than you know." She nodded toward the small stone shaft. "That's why I built the lungs, because of what you told me. You handed me the very thing I needed to get it right." He stared at her. He had come up that hill to bury her, and she was standing in the snow, thanking him. Something broke open in the man's chest then. You could see it happen. Something he had held rigid and proud for 40 hard years simply gave way, and a tremor went through that weathered face, and he had to look down at the snow for a moment and gather himself before he could speak. "You'd have had every right," he said roughly, "to let me stand here and choke on it." "I know," said Marin. "Then why?" And she thought about it, truly thought about it. And when she answered, her voice was soft, but it was steady as bedrock. "Because being right," she said, "was never the thing I wanted." A pause. "I just wanted to keep them alive." And there it was, the whole heart of her, laid bare in a single sentence, there in the blinding cold. She had not dug into that hill to prove a man wrong. She had not bled 3 weeks to win a wager she didn't even know existed. She had not turned her back on her father's warm house out of spite or pride or stubbornness. She had done it because 22 soft lives had trusted her, and there had been no one else in all the world to keep them safe. That was all. That had always been all. It was in that moment, that exact moment, that something happened off to the side. A horse coming up the slope through the drifts, and on it, her face wet, her hand pressed flat against her own chest as though to hold her heart inside it. Verna Ashby. The widow had heard the men were going up to dig out a grave, and she had come, not to dig, but because she could not bear to let the girl be carried down off that hill among strangers, with no one there who had ever once believed in her. She had come to grieve. And instead, she crested the rise, and she saw the sheep standing alive in the sun, and she saw the men standing bareheaded in the snow, and she saw Marin Hale, lean and chapped and living, standing in the middle of it all. And Verna Ashby, who had carved her own hard life out of a poor piece of ground, who had been doubted herself once, long ago, and proven them wrong, and never had a single soul there to see it. Verna Ashby began to weep. She climbed down off her horse. She crossed the snow. And she took the girl's 2 cold hands in her 2 cold hands. And she could not speak at all, because the thing in her throat was too large for words. And Marin Hale looked into the face of the one person who had ridden up that hill with warm bread instead of judgment, who had looked at her work and seen the craft instead of the folly, who had said 3 small words. That's a straight cut. On a day when those 3 words were the only thing standing between her and the dark. And something in the girl that had stayed locked and rigid and unbending all through the cold and the cruelty and the doubt and the storm finally let go. She wept. Marin Hale, who had not wept when her father cast her out, who had not wept when the valley laughed, who had not wept when the roof failed or the ewe died or the door would not open. She wept now. And not because she had won. She wept because at last After so long alone, someone had seen her. Not the wager, not the spectacle, not the fool on the hill or the clever girl who'd beaten a winter. Just her, a person who had been afraid and had done the hard thing anyway, and who had needed all this long cold while and never once said it aloud, to simply be seen. The two women held one another in the snow, and the grim burial party stood around them, hats in their cold hands, not one of them able to say a word. And the sheep chewed their cud in the brilliant sun, and the warm breath of the hill rose up, soft and steady, into the hard blue sky. It was not a moment of triumph. It was a moment of healing. And there is a difference between those two things. A difference that the whole hard valley was about to learn. Word of what stood on that hillside traveled fast, faster than the wager ever had. In the days that followed, as the great thaw began its slow work and the buried country started to show its bones again, they came. Ranchers, homesteaders, hard-weathered, broken people whose own herds lay frozen beneath the melting drifts. People who had built the proven way, the strong way, and watched the storm come through their proven walls and take everything they had. They came up the hill that they had once laughed at, and they came with their hats already in their hands. Their old certainty was gone. The storm had burned it out of them, and in its place was a thing far more useful and far more humble. Curiosity. They came with questions, and the questions were not mocking anymore. They were the desperate, honest questions of people who had seen their whole way of understanding the world fail them, and who were ready, at last, to learn a new one. How did you do it? How did you know? How do we keep this from happening to us? Ever again? And Marin Hale, the girl they had called a fool, met every single one of them with patience. She could have turned them away. She could have named every face that had laughed, every voice that had bet against her, every soul who had ridden past her hill with a pitying smile. She did not. She showed them. She showed them how she had cut the sod and why she had laid it grass side up. She showed them how she had angled the door and where she had left the gaps on purpose. She showed them the moisture barrier they had all sworn she'd forgotten, and the stone lungs at the back of the hill. And she explained, in plain and simple words, why it all worked. She held nothing back, and to every single one of them, she said the same thing in the end. The thing the old man had said to her. Don't fight the winter. Don't build a wall against a thing you cannot beat. Work with the land. Use what it already knows. The earth is a miser, so let it hold your warmth for you. It's been keeping things alive a great deal longer than any of us. She gave away the very thing that had saved her life, freely, to the very people who had wished her to fail. And in doing so, she did something far harder and far rarer than winning ever could have been. She broke the cycle, because a person who has been cast out, a person who has been mocked and doubted and written off, that person learns a hard lesson. They learn that the world is cold, and that you keep what is yours, and that you owe nothing to the people who shut the door. That lesson would have been so easy to keep. It would have been so easy for Marin Hale to become hard, to wall herself off, to take her victory and her vindication up onto her hill and let the rest of them freeze in the ruin of their own pride. But she had learned a different lesson from an old man long ago. She had learned that you do not build walls against the world. You find the place where the world cannot hurt you. And then, from inside that warm and steady place, you open the door and you let the cold and frightened people in. One of those who came up the hill in the very last days of the thaw was a man on a tired horse. He came alone. He did not come with questions about sod or stone or breathing shafts. He sat his horse at the bottom of the slope for a long while before he came up, as though he were not sure his legs would carry him, and when at last he climbed down and walked up the hill and stood in front of the girl, it was her father. He had lost a great deal in the storm, too, but the thing that had broken in him was not in his barn or his fields. It was in his face. It was in the way he could not, at first, meet her eyes. He had cast her out to teach her a lesson. He had been so certain she would fail and come home and be soft and humbled and obedient at last. And instead, while he had sat warm in his fine house with the woman he had chosen peace with, his daughter had gone out onto a worthless hill with nothing but her 2 hands and a dead man's wisdom, and she had survived the thing that had nearly killed them all. He had not taught her a lesson. She had taught him one. He stood in front of her, an old man suddenly, twisting his hat in his hands the way a boy does. "I came to say," he began, and stopped and tried again. "I came to tell you that you can come home. The door's open. It always—" His voice cracked. It should always have been open. And Marin Hale looked at her father, the man who had pointed the way off his land, the man who had chosen the easy quiet over his own child, the man who had been so sure she would break. And she waited to feel the old anger. She waited for the bitterness, the cold satisfaction, the long rehearsed words she had once whispered to herself in the dark. And they did not come, because somewhere in that long cold winter, somewhere between the digging and the doubt and the storm and the steam rising into the blue, she had let it go. Not because he deserved it. Forgiveness is rarely about what is deserved. She had let it go because she had finally understood something the old man had been trying to teach her all along. That you cannot carry both the warmth and the cold inside you at the same time. That a heart, like a hill, can only hold so much. And she had decided, somewhere in the dark, that she would not spend the warmth she had fought so hard to keep on staying cold toward a frightened old man. "I'm not coming home, Father," she said, and her voice held no anger. That was the thing that undid him. It would have been easier if there had been anger in it. This is home now. She looked back at the green-tipped hill, at the flock grazing on the first thawing grass, at the small stone chimney breathing soft against the sky. "I built it with my own hands, out of the thing you thought was worthless." A pause. "But the door's open here, too." He looked up at her then, and his eyes were full. "You'd let me come?" he asked. "After what I did?" And Marin Hale smiled, a small, tired, gentle smile that had a whole hard winter folded up inside it. "The earth doesn't hold a grudge against the frost," she said softly. "It just waits for it to thaw." And she stepped aside and held out her hand toward the open door of the hill she had built. And after a long, trembling moment, her father came in out of the cold. They did not become, in a single afternoon, all the things they might have been. Some breaks do not mend that cleanly. He went home, in the end, to the house and the life he had chosen, and the distance between them never fully closed. But it softened, it thawed, and that, perhaps, is the most honest kind of healing there is. Not the kind where everything is suddenly made whole and perfect, but the kind where two people who hurt each other simply stop adding to the cold. The kind where a door, once slammed, is quietly left open. The kind that asks for nothing and forgives anyway. The seasons turned, the way seasons do. The thaw became spring, and the spring rains came, and high on the hill, the roots of all that sod woke and reached and grew down into one another, knitting the roof into a single living thing, just as she had known they would. The hill that had been a wound in the earth became again a part of the earth, green, whole, alive. And her flock, untouched by the long white silence that had emptied the valley, grew fat on the new grass, and lambed in the warm spring nights, and multiplied. She bought the next parcel of land from a neighbor who had lost too much to stay, and was moving on to gentler country, and the one after that, in time. She never went back to live in her father's house. She never needed to. But the strange thing, the thing the valley came to understand only slowly, was that her hill never became a fortress. It never became the hard, walled-off place that a person who had been so wronged might have built. It became the opposite. It became a place people came to in the hard winters that followed, and there were hard ones, though never quite so cruel as the one that had remade them all. Her door stayed open. The widow Verna Ashby came often and stayed long, and the two women grew so close that the line between friend and family quietly disappeared, the way a footpath disappears into grass. Verna had been alone a long time. So had Marin. And somewhere along the way, without either of them quite naming it, they stopped being two solitary women and became something like a home for one another. That, in the end, was the warmth Marin had been digging toward all along. She just hadn't known it at the start. The young ones came too. Children, at first underfoot, then older, then old enough to learn. She taught them what the old man had taught her, not what to do, but how to see, how to read the slant of the light and the lean of the grass, and the way the smoke lies low before a storm, how to find the fox's den tucked into the sheltered side of the rock, how to look at a thing the whole world calls worthless, and see instead the one thing that might save your life. And on the slopes around that valley, in the years that came after, other low green shelters began to appear, dug into the hillsides, breathing soft into the winter sky. They were not pretty, but in a country where survival was the only true measure of a thing, they were beautiful in the only way that mattered. And sometimes, on a still winter evening, when the snow lay deep and clean over the whole quiet country, and the flock was warm in the dark beneath her, Marin Hale would stand outside the low door of the hill she had built, and she would watch the soft steam rising from the small stone chimney into the cold and starlit air. The breath of the hill, steady, patient, alive, and she would think of an old man with hands like dry leaves, who had crouched beside a fox's den a lifetime ago and taught a small girl how to listen to the ground, find the place the winter cannot reach. he had told her, and she had, but she understood now, in a way she could not have understood at the start, that he had never only been talking about the cold. Because the winter is not only the wind and the snow and the killing dark. The winter is also the closed door and the cold word and the long, lonely ache of being cast out and counted out and unseen. That winter, too, can freeze a person solid if they let it. That winter, too, can be outlasted if you know where to look. She had been handed the worst the world could give. A useless hill, a closed door, a whole valley certain of her ruin. And she had not built a wall against any of it. She had gone down, down into the dark, down into the cold, down into the very thing that was supposed to bury her. And she had found, deep in the heart of it, a place where the warmth could be kept. A place where life could wait out the dark. A place she had then, gently and without a word of triumph, opened up and shared. That was the thing the valley remembered in the end. Not the wager, not the storm, not even the impossible morning when the sheep had stood alive in the snow. What they remembered was the open door, the girl who had every reason to grow hard, and chose, instead, to grow warm. The one who had found the place the winter could not reach, and then made sure that no one who climbed her hill ever again would have to face the cold alone. The hill is still there, or so the story goes. Long after the girl had grown old and gone gray and become herself the strange, wise elder that children would tilt their heads at, the hill stood, grass-covered, quiet, breathing soft into the winter sky, a small green monument to a simple truth, that when the whole world goes cold against you, you do not have to freeze. You only have to go deep enough and quiet enough and brave enough to find the warmth that was waiting in the dark all along. And then, when you have found it, you leave the door open for the next cold soul who has nowhere else to go.